I'm Tom Miles, and this video on the Albuquerque Cultural and Historical Timeline is a story of how the idea came to be, how the timeline came to be installed in the convention center in the East Wing, and how it was given to all middle schools and high schools in Albuquerque to teach social studies and history. Because YouTube has a 10-minute limit, I was not able in the last video to acknowledge a number of people that supported and encouraged me throughout this 2-year project. I'll make a correction to that at the end of this video. The timeline was actually born out of a conversation with Mayor Marty Chavez in 2004, just 2 years before the 300th birthday celebration of Albuquerque, the naming and founding. I put together a very simple draft that you see behind me here and mailed it to the mayor. He passed it on to his Director of Cultural Affairs, Millie Santillanes, who suggested that I make a presentation before the Tricentennial History Task Force. Well, I made that presentation, and Don Couchman, the chairman of the task force, told me with very much tongue-in-cheek that I could name myself as a task force of one to create an Albuquerque Tricentennial timeline if I wanted to, and that there was no funding available and none was expected to support such an effort. Well, I really still liked the idea, so I began contacting historians and cultural representatives throughout Albuquerque to begin gathering data and validating it for the timeline. The timeline was managed in an Excel spreadsheet with pages being printed out, letter-sized pages, and hand scotch taped together for a draft review. The final draft review was 96 pages and about the same size as the convention center copy is today. I wanted the timeline to graphically grab people at a distance and then engage them more and more as they got closer and closer. I also wanted the timeline to visually relate what was going on in Albuquerque with what was going on elsewhere in the world at the time. And I wanted the timeline to start before the arrival of the European Spanish explorers. And that's how the date of 1400 was selected. And the timeline wanted to be more than just about the three customary cultural groups, Pueblo Indian, Hispanics, and Anglos. It wanted to reflect the experiences and the contributions of the many varied cultural ethnic groups that have come to live in Albuquerque over the years. Don Couchman warned me from the beginning that New Mexicans knew their history and cared about it a lot. So we had to be very careful and be sure that we got all the details right. All the various ethnic and cultural groups wanted their stories to be authentic representations of their life experiences. This was reasonable, understandable, and very challenging, and actually became one of the more pleasant parts of the project, interviewing the various individuals and groups to get their stories. Oñate and the 1680 Indian Pueblo Revolt turned out to be a very interesting challenge. In one of the History Task Force meetings, we were talking about the Indian Pueblo Revolt, and Millie Santillanes asked where was the St. Lawrence Day Massacre on the timeline. The interesting thing was of 10 or 11 historians sitting around the table, only 2 or 3 knew what Millie was talking about. The St. Lawrence Day Massacre is the Spanish version of the Indian Pueblo Revolt. And as a result, we decided to show both of those two very different stories of the same event on the timeline, and to represent all other stories in the same manner as we went forward. Instead of differing opinions being a problem, I think using this approach increased the richness of the timeline overall, and many thanks to all of the individuals who reviewed and critiqued the stories and the facts as the timeline grew. Based on feedback and comments over the past 3 years, I think this approach worked pretty well. Well, about 2005, the timeline was undergoing intense final reviews, edits, and revisions. But it was still just 96 pages of Excel spreadsheet, scotch taped together with very little graphics and no color. Jerry Geist, El Jefe of the Tricentennial, called in a favor from Sandia Labs and had their graphic arts department support what I call the graphicalizing of the timeline. This was great good fortune, but it was also quite a challenge. What was the graphic theme going to be? What images would we use? Where would we get them? Were they copyright protected? Could we use them at all? And placing any image on the timeline meant that we had to adjust its neighbors and neighbors of neighbors in order to balance the thing out and make it work. It was almost as complex as creating the timeline from the beginning. As March and April of 2006 rolled around, the final pieces began falling in place. Dr. Joe Sanchez, the superintendent of the Spanish Colonial Research Center at the University of New Mexico, had magnificently crafted the languaging of the Oñate story. Tom Morton, the manager of the convention center, had agreed to installing it there. Final edit cycles were wrapping up. John Hanson at the New Mexico Big Prints had offered a great price for producing the 4 by 16 foot copy. And I'd lined up a neighbor with a pickup truck to deliver the two 4 by 8 foot panels to the convention center when they were finished. Shortly after the convention center installation, I visited APS curriculum staff to see if the timeline might be useful in teaching history and social studies. The response was very favorable, and the Tricentennial was willing to print 100 more copies, 2 foot by 8 foot, for use by classrooms in high schools and middle schools throughout Albuquerque. And yes, one copy did go to the mayor. And last, but by no means least, I promise to acknowledge the individuals that supported and encouraged me throughout this 2-year project. With great appreciation, until next time, here they are.